Inglorious Basterds continues the revenge themes that director Quentin Tarantino became preoccupied with after Kill Bill. The film tells two separate revenge narratives, one that involves a typical soldiers on a mission story, and a second of Holocaust victim revenge against the war backdrop. As a genre, the war film is not as suited for a revenge narrative as the Asian films that Tarantino draws upon for Kill Bill, or the westerns that served for the inspiration for Django Unchained. Tarantino's take on revenge is different in this film than either of his other films, and is also his most problematic. That said, Inglorious Basterds contains some of Tarantino's best work, with two tensely suspenseful scenes, one the opening and the second a basement rendezvous that goes wrong, as well as the director's trademark sharp dialogue and some very strong performances. The more genre-friendly soldier storyline is what Tarantino is most concerned with in his film. Swiping his title from an Italian B-movie and drawing direct inspiration from Robert Aldrich's The Dirty Dozen and Sam Fuller's The Big Red One, Tarantino concocts the conceit of a group of 8 Jewish American soldiers led by the non-Jewish Tennessee-born Lieutenant Aldo Raine on a warpath against Nazis, eventually getting a chance to assassinate Hitler himself. Despite the fact that this storyline exists chiefly as a fantasy of Jewish revenge against Nazi oppressors, it is the non-Jewish characters who get the most development in the storyline. Of the 8 Jewish members of the Bastards, only 4 have significant speaking roles, and none of the 4 is given much character development or backstory. What is curious about Inglorious Basterds is that despite being a tale of Jewish revenge, it seems to be a film that is largely ignorant of historical anti-Semitism. Tarantino portrays the Allies as explicitly pro-Jewish, and this ignores the rampant anti-Semitism that was present in the United States, Great Britain, and France during the same period that the film is set. Furthermore, in 1944, when the bulk of the movie is set, the extent of the Nazis' crimes were largely unknown, so the Bastards' numerous acts of revenge are responding to what would have been thought of at the time as Jews being sent to work camps. Considering that the U.S. was rounding up Asian Americans at the same time, the simplistic view of the historical events cannot help but stand out. Tarantino sees all German soldiers as equally culpable for the worst crimes of the Nazis, and this is made explicit by Aldo Raine's carving of swastikas in enlisted men's heads. In case this is too subtle, Tarantino also includes the character of Hugo Stiglitz, a German soldier who killed a number of Nazi officers, and was said to be executed before he was rescued by the Bastards. The stain of the Holocaust on German identity is a theme explored in numerous German films, including Volker Schuldendorf's The Tin Drum and Michael Verhoeven's The Nasty Girl. Tarantino's way of dealing with this theme smacks of pure jingoism, however, which is especially ironic when the film includes as a major plot point the screening of a Nazi propaganda film. Tarantino makes it a point to dehumanize the German soldiers within his film. When we first see Aldo Raine carve a swastika into a soldier's head, it is after he has expressed his desire to, after the war, hug his mother and burn his uniform. This is repeated again in the film with the Mexican standoff between Wilhelm, a German soldier who has just become a father, and the Bastards. We are at first encouraged to sympathize with Wilhelm, but his death comes immediately after he refers to Bridget von Hammersmark as a traitor. While her killing of him is meant to conceal her identity, something important to their plans, the scene seems to explicitly justify the death of Wilhelm due to his expression of patriotism. This could have been handled much more ambiguously, so it is hard to not see this as a conscious statement by the director. To put the moral center of Inglorious Basterds in perspective, it might help to compare it to another film that came out a few years later. Catherine Bigelow's Zero Dark 30 was mired in controversy over its portrayal of torture. The film contained an early scene where a suspect was waterboarded and put through isolation and sleep deprivation. However, when the agents finally get information from him, this only comes after they get a piece of intelligence unrelated to him, and they serve him a breakfast in order to see if they can pry more information from him by telling him that he gave them that piece of information. Many feel that the controversy over the depiction of torture in Bigelow's film cost her a Best Director Academy Award nomination, an award that Tarantino was nominated for the film Inglorious Basterds. Tarantino's film is not the least bit ambiguous about torture. It not only advocates a use of torture in order to get information, something that is used in at least 2 scenes, but it also advocates torture as a means of revenge. Despite drawing influence from post-Vietnam era World War II movies that look back at the war from a modern perspective, Tarantino has actually regressed to a style of blind patriotism, while at the same time employing a historical revisionism that incorporates a full modern knowledge of the extent of the Nazis' crimes. Tarantino's main influence, The Dirty Dozen, has a very different view on the war. The Dirty Dozen is an almost cheerfully nihilistic movie and has a strong anti-establishment tone running through it. The team in that movie are convicts who are going on a suicide mission in the hopes of having their sentences commuted. Their mission is similar to the mission of the Basterds, but part of the point of the movie is they are chosen for it because the military brass considers them expendable and they would rather not be going on this mission. When Tarantino transfers this tone to his ideologically driven revenge movie, the result is that Robert Aldrich's black comedy becomes something morally offensive. The second revenge story is the more grounded of the two and follows the character Shoshana Dreyfus, who we see has her family slaughtered by Nazi Hans Landa in the opening scene. The scene is once again a direct homage, this time to Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, which has a very similar opening, and Tarantino even telegraphs this by beginning with a title card that says Once Upon a Time in Nazi-occupied France. The scene serves as our introduction to the film's chief villain, Landa. And what is curious is that although Tarantino's film is concerned greatly with Nazi versus American ideology, what makes Landa such a chilling villain is that he is not motivated by ideology at all. He is an opportunist who at the end of the movie does not hesitate to betray his country and ideology when he sees an opportunity for a better deal. Shoshana escapes from Landa, and when we next see her, she is the owner of a movie theater years later. She claims to have been willed this by an aunt, which seems to be a highly unlikely event considering her aunt would have been persecuted for having Jewish heritage as well, and Landa would have also presumably still been hunting her. In Tarantino's original script, she was a member of the French Resistance, and her current status could have perhaps been more easily explained by this plot point, but Tarantino cut these details in later drafts of the script. Her chance at revenge is created when German war hero Friedrich Zoller, who is the star and subject of the propaganda film Nation's Pride, becomes infatuated with her and convinces Joseph Goebbels to move the premiere to her theater. This leads to a tense scene where she is questioned by Landa about the conditions of her venue. As compared to the bride in Tarantino's Kill Bill and Django in Django Unchained, Shoshana is not as complex a character and her revenge more shallowly explored. This is partially due to having to share screen time with a whole other storyline, but it could be argued that her storyline itself was complex enough to have warranted a film of its own. In fact, a few years before, Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven had made the film Black Book about a Jewish woman who works as a spy for the French Resistance. The plot of Verhoeven's film is very similar to Shoshana's storyline, though Verhoeven creates more of a Hitchcockian thriller, and his film explores the idea of revenge with greater moral complexity. It is worth noting that Shoshana is the only Tarantino character that has to die for her revenge in these three films. However, her death isn't one that she intentionally sacrifices, but only comes after she shoots Zoller in the back, and he turns out to still be alive and having a pistol with him. A more telling sacrifice is her use of her nitrate film prints to start the fire. For somebody as in love with film as Tarantino, this may seem to be an even greater sacrifice than one's own life. There is really no moral complexity to the character's revenge, unlike The Bride, nor does the storyline say anything about the historical oppression the film is supposedly commenting on, as does Django Unchained. The ending of Inglorious Basterds itself is a bit of a litmus test for viewers of the film and whether they can accept its vision. The first time I saw the film, I had assumed that both the Basterds and Shoshana's plots would eventually fail, because if they succeeded, this would be too big a departure from actual history to be considered a secret history. However, Tarantino sets Basterds in a full-blown alternate history. Not at the beginning like most films of this type, but at the end. This felt jarring, unearned, and often depressing rather than cathartic to me upon a first viewing, and I had to divorce myself from this conceit on subsequent viewings in order to appreciate the film's virtues. The final gag of the movie, where Landa, having struck a deal, is surprised to have Aldo Rain carve a swastika into his head, is one of the film's better moments. Lando has put on the costume of a Nazi for his own purposes, and at the end of the film he thinks he can merely take it off and adopt a new one with no consequences. And in this way the carving of the swastika makes a perfect ending, even though its setup, where Aldo is carving it into the head of enlisted men, still seems problematic. Of all of Tarantino's films, Inglorious Basterds seems to be the most thematically and morally muddled. Reservoir Dogs is an unapologetically nihilistic neo-noir, but Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, Kill Bill, and Django Unchained all deal with the moral implications of the actions of their characters in some way. Inglorious Basterds merely justifies even the most heinous acts of its characters by appealing to the idea that the Nazis were worse. This is both the laziest and most problematic way to deal with the subject of revenge.